Director, Moff, Grand Moff, Commandant. You've been told these are Imperial ranks. They're not. They're positions. The moment you pull that thread, the entire system unravels, and nearly 50 years of visual evidence is about to help you do it. From the outside, the Imperial hierarchy looks immaculate. Officers stride through gray corridors in uniforms pressed sharp enough to cut, wearing rectangular plaques on their left breast packed with colored tiles, red, blue, occasional variants, in configurations precise enough to communicate hierarchy in the 10 seconds a scene needs to establish who just walked into the room. More tiles broadly signals more authority. The prop work is genuinely well executed, and the world-building functions so efficiently that audiences spent decades assuming someone built coherent architecture underneath it. Nobody did. What the verified production record confirms is that characters were assigned ranks, costumers made rank placards, nobody coordinated, and fans afterward tried to figure out an order that was never there. That's not a disappointed editorial. That's a process description. A writer invents a title that feels right for the scene. A costumer designs a plaque that looks sufficiently military. These two decisions emerge from entirely separate reference points, sometimes no reference points at all, and are never formally reconciled against each other, or against the decisions being made on a different production 5 years later. What fans call the Imperial rank system is 4 or 5 incompatible systems stacked on top of each other. One from the original trilogy, one from the expanded universe in Legends continuity, one from Disney-era film and animation in current canon, one from the ISB sequences in Andor in current canon, one from the Thrawn novels spanning both continuities. All of them share the same visual vocabulary. None of them operate according to the same rules. A single cross-media system architect with the authority to make binding rank decisions across these productions has never been confirmed to exist in any era of the franchise. This prosecution intends to demonstrate what nearly 50 years of that vacancy looks like, exhibit by exhibit. Exhibit A. The crack in the wall has a name. Orson Krennic. When Rogue One opened on the rain-soaked shores of Lamu in 2016, the camera made a deliberate choice. A white-caped figure moves through a field of black-armored death troopers against a sky the color of wet stone. In a visual palette built almost entirely on darkness, black helmets, gray corridors, cold institutional light, that single white cape is a declaration. Before Krennic has spoken a word, the scene communicates that this person answers to very few people in the known galaxy. The cinematography is doing the rank chart's job. That's precisely the problem. His title is Director. Under any coherent military structure, the distinction between rank and position is foundational. Rank is your pay grade, the general level of authority delegated to you, independent of any specific assignment. Position is your current work assignment. A general may serve as director of a weapons program. When that program concludes or orders change, the general keeps the rank and moves on. The directorship stays behind. Krennic's title is positional. He is the director of advanced weapons research, overseeing Operation Stardust, the Death Star project. His title describes his current assignment, dressed in language that sounds like permanent institutional standing. What underlying military grade sits beneath that title is where this prosecution must be transparent about evidence limits. Commander is frequently cited in fan analyses of the character. Official documentation anchoring Krennic to a specific military pay grade hasn't been confirmed in the available sources. What the verified record establishes is sufficient for the exhibit. A man wielding apparent general officer authority, commanding elite special operations troops, occupying meetings with Vader and the Emperor, while his actual position within any standard rank table remains, to the casual viewer, and arguably to the franchise's own internal documentation, invisible. The white cape tells you he matters. The director title tells you what he does. Neither one tells you where he sits. This is the franchise's structural habit. Dress a position in the language of rank, give it an authoritative name, and never specify the underlying grade. It repeats across multiple eras to constitute a pattern, not a production oversight. Moffs demonstrate the same problem with considerably more screen time and cultural familiarity. Grand Moff carries the phonetic gravity of a military rank, syllables that sound like something stamped on an official document, a designation that travels with you. Tarkin delivers it in A New Hope with the cadence of a man stating a permanent institutional fact about himself, surrounded by officers in military uniforms on a military installation. Outside that dramatic frame, it's an administrative and governmental designation, a tier of Imperial regional governor, granted extraordinary authority over both naval and ground forces within a given sector. The position was created on the suggestion of Governor Tarkin himself. He recognized the Empire needed a new category for people operating simultaneously as military commanders and regional administrators, and he had sufficient personal influence with Palpatine to get that category created, with himself as its inaugural occupant. Tarkin invented his own job title, then occupied it with the complete confidence of a man who has forgotten the difference between the office and the person holding it. Whether that reads as the most impressive act of institutional self-promotion in galactic history, or simply as evidence of how completely the boundary between rank and position had dissolved in the Empire's first decade, the prosecution submits it as evidence of both. Exhibit B. Rank plaques are the prosecution's most visual evidence, and the contradictions here require no interpretation. They exist on screen, in officially produced content, across decades of productions. They don't agree with each other. Cross-era visual analysis of official Star Wars productions has documented tile configurations appearing under identical rank designations that aren't branch differentiation variants of the same underlying system. They're flat contradictions. The rank of Major, a mid-tier officer present across enough official productions to permit meaningful cross-era comparison, appears in the documented visual record with tile arrangements that differ not in minor calibration, but in fundamental configuration. Different colors, different row structures, different logic entirely. Multiple configurations, one rank designation, plaques that can't all be simultaneously correct. No official cross-production document establishing which configuration is authoritative, or under what circumstances each applies, or whether the teams making these costumes even consulted the same reference, has ever been confirmed to exist. Branch differentiation accounts for some of what the visual record shows. Army, Navy, ISB, Stormtrooper Corps. Different branches displaying the same rank with different plaque configurations is a genuine structural feature of the in-universe system. An Army Major and a Navy Major might carry different plaques, the way real service branches use branch-specific insignia for equivalent pay grades. Done consistently, that's coherent world building. Consistent, however, is the problem. Branch differentiation does not resolve all documented contradictions. Specific rank designations appear with incompatible configurations in the same notional era, within the same official continuity, where no branch distinction has been established as the explanatory mechanism. The available framework runs out before the available contradictions do. One documented pivot in the plaque system is worth acknowledging directly. Insignia shifted from single-row to double-row tile configurations in the period around the Battle of Yavin, at 0 BBY. That transition has narrative plausibility. An institution reeling from the most catastrophic military failure in its short history might credibly reform its dress standards, and the single to double row change provides a chronological anchor for placing scenes relative to the franchise's central catastrophe. This is world building that works, and the prosecution notes it because acknowledging what functions is what separates a prosecution from a polemic. The Yavin pivot is real. It does not account for all the visual mismatches across official productions. Both of those statements are simultaneously true. Plaque inconsistencies run deeper than any single mismatch, because the production history that generated them made contradictions structurally guaranteed. The original rank plaques were aesthetic decisions, designed to look military, to communicate hierarchy within a scene, to do so quickly and visually without requiring a governing document. Characters were assigned ranks, costumers made placards, nobody coordinated, and fans afterward worked backward to find an order that was never there. Whether the original costume department consulted military reference material and what influence that had on specific color arrangements remains undocumented in the available record. The consequence is a visual system that communicates hierarchy without defining it, deployed across productions with no shared governing documentation, accumulating contradictions in direct proportion to how many productions tried to use it. Exhibit C. In real military organizations, Captain describes two categorically different authority levels depending on service branch. A naval captain holds 06, the pay grade equivalent of an Army colonel, a senior officer commanding a warship or major shore installation. A ground forces captain holds 03, a company grade officer typically commanding a unit of roughly 100 personnel. Between 03 and 06 sit multiple promotion cycles and, in practical terms, a completely different command relationship to every officer around them. When both captains share an operational context, the shared title doesn't resolve the question of precedence. It obscures it. Star Wars handles this correctly in its most prominent application of the naval designation. In current canon, Captain Nita commands the Star Destroyer Avenger in The Empire Strikes Back. Captain Piet holds an equivalent senior position before his promotion to Admiral. Both men operate in the 06 register. The dramatic weight of Nita's death depends partly on the contextual signal that this is a senior officer of genuine institutional consequence, commanding one of the Empire's primary warships within a fleet that reports to Admiral authority. The franchise gets this right when the story demands it, because Nita's death means something only if Nita's authority meant something first. Ground Forces officers across official canon productions, Stormtrooper company commanders, garrison personnel, occupation unit leaders, also carry the captain designation. Same title. Authority level implied somewhere in the 03 register. No official canonical document with cross-production authority has ever addressed what happens when these two captains share a command structure and precedence must be established. The franchise borrowed real-world terminological ambiguity at complete fidelity, including the exact portion that's genuinely confusing in actual military practice, without acknowledging it borrowed anything. Resolving this with a chart isn't the prosecution's goal. The audience most equipped to evaluate this exhibit already understands that an equivalency chart is a reductive deflection, not an answer. The point isn't to solve the gap. The point is that the gap has existed since A New Hope first put a naval captain on a Star Destroyer and a ground forces captain in a corridor. And no one with cross-production authority has ever been required to explain how they share a chain of command. Exhibit D. Andor's portrayal of the Imperial Security Bureau in current canon is some of the most carefully constructed organizational writing in the franchise's history. Extended ISB sequences show institutional machinery operating with recognizable procedural logic. Supervisors report to deputy directors. Analysts present findings through chains coherent enough to feel genuinely lived in. The conference rooms are aggressively bright. White light, white surfaces, black uniformed figures clearly accountable to a structure they enforce on each other with real professional pressure. Andor built something the franchise rarely achieves, an organization that feels like it could actually function. Sincere credit is due before the indictment arrives. ISB internal consistency is precisely what makes the Bureau's structural relationship to the broader Imperial military hierarchy a prosecution exhibit. Operating on its own positional vocabulary, supervisor, deputy director, the ISB uses titles that describe Bureau-specific roles without mapping cleanly onto any standard military grade. ISB authority overrides military rank in certain operational contexts and defers to it in others, according to criteria never systematically defined in any official cross-production document governing both organizations. Two parallel hierarchies share physical space and operational context, using different authority vocabularies, with no official source that authoritatively specifies where one ends and the other begins. The more clearly Andor depicts the ISB's internal workings, the more visible that undefined interface becomes. Because now there's enough detail on both sides of the seam to make the gap genuinely impossible to ignore. Wolf Yularen, the silver-haired ISB colonel visible in A New Hope in current canon, is that undefined interface given a face. A military-grade colonel deployed inside an intelligence organization running its own parallel positional structure. How Yularen's specific authority within the Bureau was established isn't confirmed in the available sources. What is confirmed is the structural exhibit he embodies, a military rank operating inside a positional hierarchy, in an organization whose relationship to the formal military chain of command has never received a canonical cross-production specification in any era. What the expanded universe tried. When West End Games licensed the Star Wars RPG in the late 1980s, they inherited 3 films worth of contradictory costume decisions and 0 official rank documentation, all in what would eventually be designated Legends continuity. Their task was to build a system players could actually use at a table. Specific rank designations, specific authority levels, mapped against visual evidence from the films, with enough internal consistency to survive a gaming session. The Imperial sourcebook accomplished this. Credit to them for doing what Lucasfilm never bothered to do internally. Working backward from visual evidence that was never designed to carry taxonomic weight, the authors made choices, matching screen evidence correctly where possible, filling undocumented gaps with decisions that later productions would contradict. This isn't a failure of effort. Reverse engineering an undesigned system is a genuinely hard problem, and the West End Games material remained foundational to fan understanding of Imperial hierarchy for decades. Timothy Zahn's Thrawn Trilogy, published in the early 1990s in Legends continuity, introduced Grand Admiral Thrawn, a designation carrying extraordinary authority in Zahn's narrative, built from the dramatic needs of those specific scenes rather than from any unified framework. That addition became one of the most beloved pieces of extended world-building in the franchise. Thrawn's Grand Admiral status also sits in particular tension with the original trilogy's visual record, because the rank doesn't appear confirmed on screen in the films. It entered the shared vocabulary through prose, working from implication rather than established screen architecture. When current canon brought Thrawn into Rebels and later productions, integrating that rank with the existing visual record reproduced exactly the kind of documentation gaps the EU was attempting to fill in the first place. Ultimately, the EU tried to solve the chaos. Solving it required building a new system on top of the existing one, which produced a secondary layer of partial contradictions embedded in the very act of repair. That is the structural destiny of any attempt to reverse engineer something that was never engineered in the first place. Disney's contribution to the pile. Disney-era productions didn't inherit a coherent system and corrupt it. Documentation from every pre-Disney era is specific enough to make that framing untenable. What happened instead is that new productions continued the established pattern, adding visual and terminological elements without a system architect to adjudicate their relationship to the accumulated record. Rebels, in current canon, introduced officer plaque configurations that diverge from the original trilogy's visual record in ways branch differentiation alone doesn't account for. Rogue One gave the franchise Krennic, prosecuted at the opening of this case. Andor built the ISB sequences examined in Exhibit D, careful within their own organizational scope, structurally problematic at their interface with the military hierarchy running alongside them. Moff Gideon in The Mandalorian, current canon, carries the Moff title in a post-Empire context where the institution that created it no longer formally exists. An administrative designation outliving the administration, carried forward by one man in the Outer Rim because it communicates authority effectively, and because nobody in a fractured galaxy has had the institutional resources to formally retire it. Each production made production-level decisions. None was required to reconcile those decisions against the full accumulated record. The pile grew because nobody's job description included maintaining it. That wasn't a Disney policy failure. It was the continuation of a structural absence that predated Disney's acquisition of Lucasfilm by roughly 35 years. The contrast exhibit. Tarkin's authority structure works. His standing within the Imperial hierarchy is narratively consistent across everything that depicts him. He answers directly to Palpatine. His Grand Moff designation sits outside the standard military structure while commanding both naval and ground forces within his sectors. And in A New Hope, Vader defers to him because Tarkin occupies a position with specific, understood, institutionally defined power. James Luceno's Tarkin novel, published in 2014 in Current Canon, built additional architecture around this relationship. It holds across both depictions. He was important enough for someone to actually think it through. A character present in that many scenes, requiring other characters to understand the power dynamics, needed actual structural coherence to function, and he received it. The franchise demonstrated through Tarkin that it's entirely capable of building coherent institutional hierarchy when a specific story demands it. Why that rigor applied to Tarkin and not to the Major whose plaque changed configuration between productions is the prosecution's central question, and the answer has been consistent throughout this case. Coherence was a character-level decision, not a system-level commitment. When a specific story required you to understand exactly why Tarkin could tell Vader to stand down, someone built the explanation. When a background officer needed a plaque that looked military, someone made a plaque that looked military. One of those decisions produced documentation. The other produced a prop. The defendant isn't George Lucas, not Timothy Zahn, not Dave Filoni, not any individual writer, designer, or production team working in any era of the franchise. The evidence doesn't support individual accountability, and the prosecution never sought it. The defendant is an institutional absence that has persisted without interruption across every era. The absence of a single cross-media system architect with the authority to make binding rank and position decisions, and the mandate to make those decisions stick across productions. In 1977, aesthetic costume decisions were made with no governing rank taxonomy and no cross-production documentation, because none was required to make A New Hope. The plaques looked right. The titles felt appropriate. The absence of documentation wasn't identified as a problem because it wasn't a problem yet. Then the franchise expanded across films, novels, games, animation, and streaming. And that absence became a growing structural failure, addressed locally by each subsequent era, without the cross-production authority to produce a global solution. EU writers in Legends Continuity spent 2 decades reverse engineering explanations for a visual system never designed to carry that weight, producing genuinely good work while embedding a secondary layer of contradictions in the repair itself. What Disney-era productions did was continue the established pattern, careful within individual productions, unconstrained across them, adding to the pile because no one's job description included preventing it. Structurally, the chaos was inevitable. Every era produced it for the same reason. No one held cross-production authority. No binding rank documentation governed costume decisions. Responsibility for system-wide consistency belonged to either nobody or everybody, which amounts to the same thing. One final observation, left with the jury rather than pressed as a finding. The Empire's rank chaos, positions dressed as ranks, parallel hierarchies with undefined interfaces, authority that reads differently depending on who holds it in which corridor, maps with uncomfortable precision onto how a certain kind of authoritarian institution actually maintains control. Power through ambiguity. Precedence determined by proximity to the Emperor rather than by documented hierarchy. A structure legible enough to command compliance without being specific enough to be challenged on procedural grounds. Tarkin invents his own title, and Palpatine ratifies it. Krennic's white cape communicates his authority more clearly than any rank table does. The system doesn't need to be coherent to function. It needs to be legible enough that everyone in the room knows who to fear. That reading is more elegant than the production history supports. Production history tells a less elegant story. The prop department made plaques that looked military. Nobody documented what the colors meant, and nearly 5 decades of expansion did the rest. Subscribe for more.